Welcome to our August Chicas Charlando streaming. This topic this month topic is forming family. My name is Hope Zeru from the Latino Commission on AIDS, and I'm here with a colleague of mine, Devin, and our guest speaker that we have among us today, who also will introduce herself in a minute, to join us in our conversation that we'll be having together today about forming family and what that entails in our community and what kind of resources do we have available. So as I mentioned, my name is Hope Zil. I've been at the Latino Commission on AIDS for almost 3 years now, and I'll be part of the panel today discussing forming family and reproductive health and what that entails in terms of discussion and in terms of resources and how we see that in our community. So Devin, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Devin Diaz. I do capacity building here at the Latino AIDS Commission. I, along with Brian Medina and David Garcia, work on a transgender capacity building grant. So we work with New York-based trans-based organizations to provide them capacity building, and I also am a contributing writer to a couple of publications, mainly around writing about race, class, and gender, and that's me.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so I guess that leaves me. My name is Zayla Jarrett. I'm a program manager with Pure Health Exchange. We're a national nonprofit organization currently in 5 cities, whose mission and vision is to empower young people with the knowledge, skills, and resources they need to make healthy decisions. We do this by training undergraduate college students to teach a skills-based health education, again, in 5 cities, but here in New York City, I work with 2 of our colleges, reaching just under 450 college volunteers and serving just under 6,000 ninth graders in New York City. So that's what I do in my day-to-day time. In terms of personal interest, I am really interested in explorations of love, gender, sexuality, things of that nature. And that's been a really big motivating factor for me. Specifically with PhD, I've worked a lot on our LGBTQ inclusivity work, as well as thinking about how we can position ourselves as an organization that really is invested and embedded in equity conversations when it comes to those populations. So a lot of interest around LGBTQ work and generally just like health education more broadly, with a specific focus on like sex education.
Oh, great. So we have a room full of experts that will be chipping in this conversation of forming family and reproductive health. So please don't forget to tweet online on Twitter using hashtag Chicas Charlando to join in the conversation and ask questions anytime during the streaming. So let's get started and with our first questions and see where we can go with, or what forming family looks like in our community. So what kind of conversations should we have with our community to bring awareness to families in equitable manner and using the sexual and reproductive justice lens? So what does that kind of conversation looks like? And Devin or I'm sorry, how do you pronounce your name again?
Zayla.
Zayla.
Yeah.
You can jump in and take it.
I can start.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I think within like Latinx culture, like many cultures and families, particularly in mine, I think that the ability to terminate a pregnancy is something that we just like don't speak about.
Mm-hmm.
I know like last Christmas, I mean, I just turned 25, so my older sisters are finally starting to talk to me like I'm an adult, and it's like really weird. But she told me about this experience that she had, and like no one knew about it, and she didn't feel comfortable to tell anyone. And she was 19 years old, and so I was thinking about my older sister and like what she must have been feeling at 19, and like how I wish that it was more of an open dialogue with her and my mother and my grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
And I think looking at it from like a trans lens, I think so many women don't know that they have the possibility of forming a family because a lot of them are focusing on like surviving most of the time, so they can't think about forming a family. So I think, for me personally, I think these are two things that I see in my life that I wish that I had more of a conversation of. It kind of, it always feels like a white thing. Like my family won't talk about it, and it feels like it's something like white people do. Like, that's American culture. That's not us.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what about you, Zayla? Like, what kind of conversation should we be having around in our community around forming family?
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with what Devin said, particularly around it seems like a white thing. I think the reproductive justice movement has often been at the hands of like cis white women leading that conversation, and so as such is like reproduce this understanding that cis white women or cisgender white women are the folks who reproductive justice is most about, which often means the conversation stops at abortion and doesn't really extend into other ways that communities of color are impacted by other aspects of reproductive justice. So for me, in approaching this question and conversation, some key areas that I think about with regard to reproductive justice and kind of forming families in an equitable way is thinking about the carceral state, so like the prison systems and kind of policing, how policing breaks up communities, and oftentimes you get the fake mythology of like a single Black mother, a single mother of color, when there's no kind of accountability from like the state for putting folks in that position. And so it leaves folks in this really weird position where they're like raising families on their own potentially, or don't have access to how they want to form and structure their family. I think another really big issue is access to equitable healthcare and health education, particularly that centers queerness and transness. So in thinking about the kind of education that even, again, with Pure Health Exchange that I'm working on, really pushing to include more honest and direct conversations about like trans bodies and kind of how does that actually impact how we think about structuring families. Like it's totally viable for folks to think about queer and trans folks forming families that one are structured in similar ways to like heterosexual and cis couples, but even beyond that, like what are ways that we're still thinking about health education that encourages folks to see themselves as like valid and real and also able to then form families. I think the last thing that's really important to me is like history. History is this big thing that I think we haven't figured out how to grapple with in a way transparently or honestly. But there are a lot of components I think that go into why communities of color have been integral to the reproductive justice movement, often at the expense and kind of, again, autonomy. So thinking about the birth control pill trials and how those went on in Puerto Rico, and like a lot of Puerto Rican women in the 1950s were subjected to testing without actually consenting or having like the agency to talk about that. And that's led to like a lot of modern birth control methods, which are like great, but again, we don't talk about the history there as well. We don't talk about like the histories of, again, like what was just going on with BYP 100 with Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, and the 11 enslaved Black women in America who are really the founding mothers of gynecology, but we attribute it to like a white cis man who was like the doctor who mutilated them and performed surgeries. And I also don't think we talk enough about the ways in which trans people have been integrated into our histories and have had communities and have had families throughout history that we kind of glossed over. So one really poignant example is thinking about like also bodily autonomy and sexual assault. Frances Thompson, who was an enslaved Black woman who ended up resisting sexual assault and then gathered together with a bunch of other enslaved women to push back, and was actually one of the first Black women, Black trans women especially, to speak in front of, I believe, Congress or whatever the ruling kind of government at that time was. But in that moment, she was immediately considered a fraud and her autonomy was stripped away in terms of like her having been sexually assaulted, her having access to like a family member, of living among other women because they thought she was a man and they described her as such. So thinking about the aspects of history that we often gloss over as well.
Wow, that's great.
I'm so happy you're here. What a wealth of knowledge. Wow. Oh my goodness, I didn't know that. I'm going to
see, that's why
the things to read after this is done.
Right. That's why history is really important when we talk about forming family and reproductive health. And one thing you touch upon that's really, really important as well is access to care, right? Access to equitable care. If we don't have access to care, how are we directing this conversation? Where are we directing people to, to go to? We may start the conversation, but then, if people don't have access to care, how are they able to make informed decisions to care for themselves and their partner and their family as a whole? So great answers. So we touched upon this a little bit, but how is this inclusive or not inclusive of women of trans experiences? Like, so what kind of lack of resources there is, or provider in our community that are providing resources to trans communities, specifically the trans women community? Does forming family exclude them? What are your take on this?
I think, okay, so I get really like dramatic when I'm sick. And so every time I get sick, I think I'm gonna die. And so last summer I got like the flu like really bad, and I thought like that I was gonna die. So I went to the ER, but I was like not so sick that I didn't have to call 911. Like I walked to the ER. So I like did the whole thing and like was with my doctor, and then I had to disclose at some point to my doctor that I'm trans. And then so I was immediately like being asked about like my HIV status, and then like if I wanted to get tested and like all of these things, and I was literally just there for the flu. And like I understand, like it just felt really pointed, and like not everyone gets that treatment. And so I think that I said all of that to say I think that colors a lot of trans women's experience when they go to the doctor, like assuming like promiscuity or sex work. And so I also, when I transitioned at 14 with a doctor, a lot of it was like warnings against like I'm like telling the doctor I'm trans, and he's like telling me about like, well, here's like your risk for HIV, and I'm like, I'm 14, like I'm just here for like hormones. But I wasn't asked like, have you thought about like freezing sperm? Like have you thought about like one day being a mother? Like so I never considered, like I think what the state and what like doctor, like whoever like does, you kind of follow, even if that's not your belief. Like I just believed for a long time that a family just wasn't possible because I wasn't presented with options. So I think it starts with healthcare providers, and I think it starts with like making that like a normalized thing, that and like also like making like freezing sperm something really accessible for women. Because you are kind of giving that up once you start hormone replacement therapy. It is like sterilization. Yeah.
Wow, great. I think one great thing you touch upon is normalizing this, process. Everyone is allowed to have family, regardless of your gender or sexuality, and opening up that discussion and having that, even starting that discussion with your provider. When you go to your provider, so what are you thinking? What are some actions available? Would be a great segue to having everyone start thinking about it. And it's an option. Not everyone wants to have a family, but those who want to have a family can consider the option available to them.
Right. Yeah.
And Zelaya, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And the trans broken arm syndrome, as like Devin is referring to, which is essentially you go into the doctor for a broken arm and they immediately say you're trans, so your broken arm is because you're trans, and like that's all that matters, is a real ass thing. It's like your transness becomes the only way that folks engage with you, as opposed to thinking about you as a person, which definitely I think limits experiences and makes navigating healthcare providers like that much more difficult. So I definitely agree. I think it has to start also with providers. It has to start in like a framework that acknowledges that transness isn't a totalizing thing. It doesn't like underwrite or determine our humanity. It's just like a facet of any other identity that folks have, and kind of thinking about that aspect. I think generally with thinking about forming families though, and this idea of like, again, reproductive justice, there are like two questions that often get entangled that need to be separated. One around like the social experience of being a trans woman, and the other around like the actual like physical and body, like biology or like the biological perspective. So the example that I had is exactly with like freezing sperm. It's oftentimes something that's not discussed when you go to start HRT. It's like you want your body to be feminized. You want these secondary sex characteristics, but at what expense? And doctors times often don't prioritize that part of the conversation because there are other things that they think are more important. So thinking about, like, again, the actual like biological realities of being a trans woman and how we can start supporting folks in their thinking about forming families if they want to form a family in that way, and just having transparent conversations. And then I think with the social aspect is thinking about this idea that like biological families are more important or valid than families chosen from like adopting a child or being a foster parent, being a chosen family. So not even like having children, but having folks that are like under you that you feel really strongly about. Like I casually refer to two of my closest friends who are only 3 and 4 years younger than me as my children. And they call me like mother and ma affectionately. And like, that's our go-to language. And like, that's totally valid. And so even if that's not a structure I carry on into the future, knowing that if I'm 40 years old and I want to like take again another young cis queer trans person under my wings, that's a form of family too. And that we should also prioritize and start validating families that aren't just created through biological means.
I definitely agree. Making all that acceptable in our societies today, you know, especially with the stigma that is so associated with, you know, having family, whether you're trans or, you know, it's just so normalized that the cis community, their way of family forming is the right way, and everybody else is just being stigmatized because it has identified as not the norm. But I think we as a society, we can start having that conversation and changing the norm, making a new norm, right? And accepting this family or having family as, you know, whoever we choose it to. It can be biological, it can be, you know, your nephews, you know, you adapt them and become your own family. So there's so many ways of having family, and we can start our conversation around that, you know. Wherever you are, let's start the conversation. And just a quick reminder, use the hashtag Chicas Charlando to really tune in the conversation and join the conversation. And you can ask questions, clarification if anything, nothing, or you need clarification on anything else that we are discussing today. So carrying on the conversation and moving on, you know, with the same topic, but let's now discuss about, you know, women with the same sex partners. So how does forming family entail when we're talking about partners who are the same sex?
I think the same underlying message of like normalizing and being accurate in kind of how we're explaining and telling is important here. For queer women or women who identify as lesbian or bisexual, primarily because so many queer and trans people are in families and have structured families. And so thinking about some data that came out, I believe in 2012 or 2013, right around marriage equality and talking about how like, that was a really big thing in California and then kind of spread to the nation. But the fact that in the South, a majority of like queer and trans people, one, are of color, and two, are of color who have families. So a lot of the biggest family structures are like Black and Latinx families who are queer and have children. But oftentimes, again, this narrative gets like glossed over or just kind of ignored for like a larger kind of white perspective, to be quite honest. So like the gay rights movement being heavily white and having kind of washed over the necessary components of like what do communities of color, what do queer folks of color actually need to form families, to survive, to thrive, to have access to the things that they want. Which marriage is important, but maybe isn't the overall thing with regard to, again, seeing their family structures as valid and acceptable. So really, again, this idea of like normalizing and making things feel like, it's just not out of the ordinary, operating against that like heteronormative or hetero-assuming framework.
And I also think it's really important to like going on what you said on like white like men on like making like queer liberation about gay marriage. Like I think I'm from Tennessee, so I think a lot of people back home thought that gay marriage like began in 2012. Like people didn't start to commit to each other until the government said like go ahead. They're like, there have been so many queer relationships that have existed in like a marriage, like a framework of a marriage long before it was passed. So I think that like these families like already exist, like same-sex partners with children already exist. Women and who have relationships with other women who decide to form families already exist. So I think these women need to be at the forefront of that conversation and kind of letting people like me know that like aren't involved in that, like this is how we have been existing, this is how we continue to, and this is how you can best help us. Because I think they're the experts in what they need and how we can best support them. So I'm always interested in like letting those people lead those conversations.
Wow, that's great. So, I mean, just a little follow-up question, like how, where, or when should that conversation start? Like thinking about when you're growing up within your household. I mean, nowadays, I know that some teachers have started talking about this in the classroom for the little ones to know that, you know, if someone comes from a household that they have two daddy or two mommy, it's okay. You know, where do you usually start? Like, or when is it okay to start having conversation with the younger generation?
I mean, I think it's the adults that need to like I think kids get it. I think kids get it better than adults do. Mm-hmm. Like I think kids will like read a story and accept that someone's skin is made of like blue and their hair is green. Like they just like if you tell them something, it's like they'll accept it. I think they're better at it than us actually. Mm-hmm. So I think it has a lot to do with like parents thinking like, what does this mean if I make this normal? And like I think it means something about you, not about like Jimmy's two moms dropping him off at school. Mm-hmm. Like your feelings about it don't mean anything about them. And I think that's what people don't realize is that their feelings are like their like own projections. Mm-hmm. So I think, I don't know, I think it's the parents that like need to sort themselves out because I think the kids got it better than we do.
Yes, agree. I think the conversation starts with yourself before it starts with children. Yourself assuming that folks or adults would, in terms of thinking about how we already like reify again how we reinforce the belief that heterosexuality and that being cisgender are like the things that you should be, like they're the normal things. And so in thinking about even before your child is born or like right at birth, the ways in which we have those shirts of like, my son's such a ladies man or like XYZ, which are really gross characterizations and normalizations of again,
sexualizing babies.
It's like the baby has not expressed or spoke anything, does not care about sex as a baby, and yet we are already imposing all of these beliefs onto that child. And so kind of being self-reflective and seeing how much do you already contribute to setting up an environment like that, that again limits the comfort that people do have in expressing things. Because exactly as Devin said, I think starting with young kids as young as possible, especially like when they're in school, like I love schools, working with again PHE and kind of working in the framework of high schools. I think schools are really important, but I think oftentimes the biggest barrier isn't like the school community or school culture, it's like the parents. It's kind of how parents have say and leverage in that conversation and can make it really difficult to start actually addressing problematic and reinforced norms that we want to shift and change. So.
Yes. It all go back to the norm that we are accepting or changing, right? So what we are normalizing and what we're not normalizing.
Yeah, and I think that like the world isn't changing, we're just hearing from more people. Like
it's literally what it is.
Oh, that's great. So what options are available to couples living with HIV to form families that we know of? I know for a fact that the starting point is, you know, for couples living with HIV or in sort of discordant couples, when one is living HIV and the other is not, adherence to medication is key, you know, because treatment is prevention, and data have shown that, you know, those who are adherent to medication reduce tremendously the chances of transmission. So and it always starts with being adherent to medication. And another option is for, again, so discordant couple, the person, the partner who is not living with HIV can also speak to the provider about PrEP. PrEP is something that has been changing the landscape of HIV and HIV prevention. So, they can engage in PrEP and take PrEP during or prior to conceptions, so that they can conceive without any fear of transmitting the virus to the unborn baby and have healthy babies. And study have been done on this method of forming family or preconceptions, so that it's effective. And children have been born like that way. And right now in the U.S., we don't have many children that are being born with HIV. However, it doesn't mean we have none, right? So we have made tremendous progress in the HIV field in terms of transmission from mother to child. However, more needs to be done, specifically when we're discussing intimate partner violence. That's something that we didn't touch upon so far, but that also contributes to how we are having this type of conversation and how we are forming families. Any take on that?
I guess my only take on that is that I think in the circles that we're in, especially in New York, like I guess on the coasts of this country, we know that these options are available, but I'm just thinking about everywhere in between, and I forget when, if I'm in New York too long and I haven't gotten back home, I forget that a lot of this is hasn't reached other parts of the country, being undetectable even.
Exactly.
And not necessarily having to transmit HIV to your child if you're carrying a child. So I think that there's such a responsibility in having these conversations be public and having these conversations I guess I'm just thinking about how my parents didn't know about what trans was really until they saw Laverne Cox on the cover of Time magazine. And then they were oh, we stand in the grocery store and she's on that and she's my daughter. So I guess it's cool. It's chill. So I want this too, because I think we've gotten to a really, especially in Europe with ending the epidemic, I think a lot of amazing things are happening, but I also want to focus on everything that's happening in the South or in the Midwest. Making sure that information gets there.
Right. I mean, it's really important that we disseminate the information all over the country, and certain areas are hard to reach other than, compared to other areas. Yeah. And the South seems to be the area that is strongly the most. One, it has to do with the geographical setup of it, because many people it's much more of a rural setting than we are here in New York City or in the New York area. And the resources, it's just limited resources when you're talking about the South, and what access to health or healthcare looks like. All of those are a limitation in terms of what we can do when it comes to forming family and reducing the risk of transmission from the mother to unborn baby and unborn child.
Yeah. I think it's particularly interesting when you think about the South. I'm from North Carolina originally. It's a small town of 10,000 people. And that's definitely the case with regard to access to resources. New York has been a blessing with regard to public transit versus being back home. You have to know how to drive. You have to have someone who's willing to put in that labor, to put in the time to chauffeur you around to various places. And then those are specific resources. So one's targeted and who have the knowledge, who have the understanding, versus like going to see your primary care provider or another physician. Like maybe that person is helpful with a certain set of tasks, but again, the stigma around having HIV, the stigma around having an HIV positive patient, like that's definitely heavily embedded, I think, in certain mentalities. And something that I often think about with a lot of like health inequities is like, how are we tackling the provider in this like situation? How are we actually training our providers to be more comprehensive, to know the options that are available, and to have like a destigmatized lens when they're thinking about engaging with various populations? So even thinking about how like most medical schools still don't require like an LGBTQ course. And so you don't even get an intersection of like, how does my identity as like a trans person or a queer person then impact my access and like need for certain resources, but also how I want you to engage with me so that I'm not fearful going to you. I know there's like a really popular article going around about how Black MSM and trans women in parentheses. So men who sleep with men and then trans women who also sleep with men are still at a really high rate for HIV infection and AIDS. And thinking about the social component of that too, I think people are really caught up in the numbers and the statistics and kind of thinking about that. But like the social stigma, like if you're taught that two Black queer people loving each other is wrong, of course you're not going to pursue resources. Of course you're not going to talk to your provider about engaging in those kind of activities, because you're so heavily weighed down with like stigma and shame. And stigma and shame, I think at the core of it, are oftentimes huge barriers, sometimes bigger barriers than I think actually having access to a resource. Because if a resource is right next to you, yet you have not overcome the shame and stigma in it, what are the chances that you're going to actually use that resource then?
How do we start to overcome our stigma and shame in our community? Where do we start? How do we start? I mean, this has been part of our conversation, you know, with HIV, Phil, when we talk about gender and sexuality, it's always the common denominator when we talk about barriers. And it's I don't know, personally, I'm just sad to see that as we progress, it's just that is still the main barrier that we'll still face when it comes to, you know, having access to care. You know, when people are not comfortable discussing their sexuality, and they're not comfortable talking about having this type of discussion with the provider, within the community, with their parents, with their family members. Where do we start? How do we start?
Oh my gosh. Yes, that is like the question of the
century.
Beyond that, yeah. Hard.
Wow.
I definitely think a part of it is like honest and transparent conversations. So I think dialogue is incredibly powerful and impactful. And as we are currently in the age of free speech around like Charlottesville and all these other moments and folks engaging in that conversation, I think that is a conversation that needs to die, and we need to invest in like actual dialogue. So dialogue where we are listening to folks, as Evan said, who now have mics, who now can actually speak. We're having more voices at the table. So actually centering those and starting to engage in like honest and transparent dialogue. Because a lot of things have been said repeatedly and consistently, yet the folks who are in power and have the ability to shift certain things aren't doing that work. They aren't like decriminalizing or legalizing or like destigmatizing certain things. Like the fact that in New York City, only, I believe there are 40,000 ninth graders who currently aren't receiving health education in ninth grade. Most New York City high school students are receiving that in 11th or 12th grade, which by that point, they've already started to make critical decisions about their health, whether or not they're going to engage in sex and use a barrier method, whether or not they're going to go talk to a mental health provider. Right. And so in programming in ninth grade and really trying to pull health education / just general like those conversations down into lower grades, thinking about the impact that has and having open and honest dialogue to start affecting some of those changes that definitely need to happen. Like I think policy has to come along with it. I think other kind of really big things have to happen too. But I think at the end of the day, like transparent and direct dialogue is oftentimes a really big key social shifter.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think going back to you mentioning Charlottesville, I think there needs to be a moment of realizing that racism isn't just people being mean. Racism is what this country is like dependent on. Like capitalism is dependent on racism, and it always has been. And I think there needs to be a shift where like stigma like dealing with like people of color or like trans people or queer people. I don't think, and it's no longer, should no longer be our problem. Like I feel like these like white people in Charlottesville and beyond be like, racism is your problem. You need it to exist. You need it to feel good, or like you need it to feel like you have like some kind of standing, but what are you and who are you without it? And I don't think we've imagined a world or a country where like, who are we without it, and who are these people without this stigma? So I think what I would like to see is like, I don't know if it's gonna go away anytime soon, but what I would like to see is for people to shift the responsibility onto the people who are in a position to make it go away.
That's
for people of color and for Black people and for queer people, for all those people at all those intersections to like create their own communities and spaces and award shows and like, so we can create your own things. And
I agree. So we can stop talking about whiteness and stop talking about things that are beyond our control or power and that we didn't set up, and start talking about actual issues like intimate partner violence with trans women. Like that's a major issue for Black trans women, and it never becomes prioritized because we're so focused on the kind of white supremacist, racist bullshit that like white people exert over other folks. So shifting away and actually having those internal conversations that are more important to our communities thriving, and then having access to the things that we need internally.
Exactly. And really discussing mental health as well, and something that we don't always discuss in our community, you know. And recently I saw a post online about, you know, mental health is not just for white people, and it's true. And, you know, it's having that conversation around, you know, mental health and being able to open up and discussing, you know, when we're feeling any kind of way, because health encompasses everything within us, from physical to mentally to spiritually. So however we need to, whatever resources that we need to seek to be well, we need to do that, and it needs to be okay. We need to normalize that as well, you know, as in the Black community, in the Latino community, in all communities, especially women. We go through a lot. We endure a lot in our society. However, we don't take the time to take care of ourselves, and we just compound, you know, all the hurts and all the stress that we have in our community. It just pile up, and we don't discuss it. You know, mental health is a huge thing that we need to discuss. It shouldn't be the thing hidden in the closet anymore. It shouldn't be the thing that we are afraid to discuss, but open up and have that conversation as well.
Yeah. I mean, that like directly relates to like police brutality. Like I think a lot of like the Black mothers who have lost children and kind of like the trauma that they're experiencing and having to like come to terms with that, and how we often applaud them for being brave and strong. But without recognizing that, like, that's traumatic. Like having a child who is taken from you by people you're told to trust, by law enforcement, is like, it's not an okay experience. And extending beyond that to thinking about forming families. I've seen so many like Black women say, I'm gonna think twice about having a family. I don't wanna bring a child to this world if I have to like endure this conversation, endure the possibility that one day they'll be shot by like law enforcement. And I think it's like an important conversation to have around both the mental health of like women of color, but specifically again then these larger structures that really are impacting reproductive justice, are impacting how we form families, but oftentimes become deprioritized as we focus heavily on abortion or heavily on other issues that frankly just aren't at the forefront, I think, of a lot of folks' social navigations.
Wow. I agree. I think of I don't know if either of you have read Beloved by Toni Morrison. And for like so many like cis white women, reproductive justice might be like the ability to terminate a pregnancy, but for so many Black women, it's like, can my child live and exist? And like that isn't considered. Police brutality is never considered a reproductive rights issue, but it is.
Or even the prison in Tennessee, how they were sterilizing inmates there and providing a shorter sentence. We'll take 30 days off of your sentence if you were sterilized now. That way to decrease the likelihood that, like, again, cis Black men are producing families they can't, quote unquote, take care of because they're caught in the police system, they're caught in the carceral system. So it's like, yeah, it extends heavily into like how the police state is involved in this too.
These conversations are hard, but we need to have them. It's really important that we engage in these hard, uncomfortable conversations. That's the only way we can move forward. That's the only way we can normalize things, and that's the only way we can be free and grieve and be who we are, and not being afraid of what, who, or so and so think.
And I think there's a like a level of necessary discomfort. Like, this conversation, like to your white grandparents or to like your friends, to let them know that you're dating a trans girl, or like to like all of these, like, this is gonna be like uncomfortable a little bit, but like ultimately what we're going to get is so much better than where we are. So like, why not deal with it for a little while?
I mean, that's just part of it. We have to deal with it regardless. So the earlier the better, the sooner the better.
It's a necessity. Like, think about all the trans women who have been murdered this year, who literally could have started families. A lot of them, again, not always, but intimate partner violence has been a really big issue there. Like, men feeling shame around being like trans women, and how like that is totally fine, it's totally okay, it's totally valid. What are ways to be about building family structures that don't hinge on, again, a reproduction in the typical sense, and then also that center these difficult conversations. Like telling your parents you're dating a trans woman may be hard, but thinking about all the freedom and like other family structures that suddenly come out of that, it's just like that liberation is so much more exciting, I think, than kind of investing in we have to have this single narrative or these few narratives that we know folks can fit into.
I agree, definitely agree. Are there any questions? So people remember, you can ask questions on Twitter or during the live chat, hashtag Chicas Charlando, to ask any question to any of us on the panel today. If there are any questions, you can always send a question later to any of us, and we'll be sure to reply to you. I would like to thank you all for being here. Thank you especially.
So much. Thank you.
Thank you. You provided great insight. This conversation was very rich. Thank you.